man said to be the next U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Joel Pollak, says relations between South Africa and the U.S. will improve only if Pretoria overhauls its foreign policy. Pollak, who is currently an editor at right-wing website Breitbart, says South Africa must choose whether it wants to preserve economic relations with the U.S., and if so, the country would have to give up its genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Now, relations between the two countries are at an all-time low after America's decision to expel Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. Pollak says the move was extreme but appropriate, given Rasool's comments that President Donald Trump's policies are rooted in white supremacy. Rasool is set to return to South Africa after he was declared persona non grata by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. For more on this, we're joined in studio by Newzroom Africa's Qaanitah Hunter. It's great to talk to you, Qaanitah. And what a bombshell of an introduction that was. It's very interesting to see two very prominent players in American politics at the moment are both South African born, ironically.
Absolutely, and have links to South Africa and quite keen focus on the domestic developments here. Joel Pollak has been quite outspoken with regards to South African policies. It was him that, it is his article quoting Ebrahim Rasool in that webinar that raised the ire of Marco Rubio, resulting in the action that we saw over the weekend. But Joel Pollak has been seen as the person that is a favorite of Donald Trump to be ambassador to South Africa. He says he has it on good authority that he is the preferred candidate. But when will the U.S. President Donald Trump send this ambassador to South Africa? It remains to be seen, particularly because of the tensions that have unfolded in the last few months. Now, Michelle, the question is, does South Africa accept his nomination to the country, given the comments? What are some of the comments that Joel Pollak has made? He called for financial sanctions against President Cyril Ramaphosa. He in the past has criticized policies of the South African government. And more than that, he has set out what would be the terms for a normal, viable relationship between the U.S. and South Africa in terms of restoring diplomatic relations. Let's take a listen to what he said.
South Africa has to amend or limit the Expropriation Act, which is what the president reacted to first. It has to change the application of its Black economic empowerment laws, because right now they discourage American investment and foreign investment really of any kind, because investors show up and immediately have to hand over a huge chunk of their equity to someone they've never met before. So that's a problem. And there are other foreign policy stances that South Africa has taken, such as its alliance with Iran through BRICS and its pushing of the ICJ case against Israel, its support, at least the ANC's support for Hamas. These are all big problems in the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa.
So it's easy, right? If South Africa wants to be on better terms with the U.S., make large-scale changes to some of the policies that are so integral to how we are conducting a democratic South Africa.
And I asked Joel Pollak that, is you essentially asking the president or the country to overhaul its entire foreign policy? And he says, well, it's worth it if you want the economic relations with the United States. And so this has been described by some analysts as extortive foreign policy by the Trump administration. But he says South Africa must come to the table, willing to negotiate and make its demands heard. Now, it's interesting to see how South Africa has responded in the last week and more so since January. They're insisting that they are relying on diplomatic conversations and diplomatic relationships to solve this impasse. But the reality of it is that without an ambassador in Washington, and if this is the ambassador to South Africa, it's going to make it very difficult, Michelle.
Certainly. I mean, the issue with South Africa relying on diplomacy and relying on discussions to take place with the Trump administration is that the Trump administration has already made up its mind. There is no convincing, at least on the face of it, Qaanitah, one way or another.
It appears that way. And I mean, these are bold demands to make. It started with the Expropriation Act being the bone of contention, and then it was regarding the South Africa's BE policies. And so an interesting conversation is how far does South Africa, or how willing will South Africa be to negotiate with the Trump administration. And so the question really is if Ambassador Rasool did not say what he said, and if that webinar did not happen, what would have been the status of the relationships? The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, is downplaying this impasse at the moment, saying that, they're not having sleepless nights about it, but essentially that, having this representation, South African representation in the US and US representation in South Africa would be critical, especially as we edge closer towards two important moments. The first is AGOA talks later in the year, and then the handing over of the G20 presidency to the US. And so those are big diplomatic moments for South Africa, let alone the suspension of aid, as well as, other tensions that persist. And so who are the people that are doing the talking matters? And so whether or not South Africa accepts Pollak's credentials, when and if Donald Trump sends him, is going to be an interesting one.
So we heard from the president yesterday. He was speaking at an event by the Department of Basic Education on early childhood development. And the conversation got going, obviously, around Ebrahim Rasool, him being declared persona non grata over the weekend. And the president was his usual diplomatic self. He said, we're not being blue-ticked by the US. Those conversations are underway. How urgent is it that the president said it's not very urgent for us to appoint a new ambassador, but given what's unfolding now, how urgent would you say it actually is?
I think that Ramaphosa will take the approach of kind of putting South Africa's proverbial head down while the winds blow over, because things are a little hostile at the moment. So there will be an effort to buy some time as he picks a new ambassador. It takes a long time from the time the president, identifies someone to the time that person is eventually sent to the US. Similarly, the opposite is true of a US ambassador to South Africa. But Ramaphosa seems to be willing to keep that on ice for the moment and then send alternative diplomatic channels, and that is that group of envoys that he keeps speaking about.
And has that happened?
No.
Have any discussions happened with any envoys from South Africa in the US? Because we know AfriForum and Solidarity, they may not have spoken to Donald Trump himself, but they've had meetings with officials at the White House.
Yeah, up until now, the envoys have not been appointed and they've not been sent. And it's a difficult one because the DA, which is a GNU partner, wants to be part of that delegation. And who does the president send to actually represent South Africa when you have this fragmentation within his own government?
Right.
And so what are the things that South Africa is going to negotiate on, given these demands? Are they willing to make any concessions? It doesn't appear to be that way. And so, like you said earlier, Michelle, it's difficult to engage diplomatically when the US seems to have already made up their minds.
Certainly. Qaanitah Hunter, thanks for coming into studio and thank you for your patience. We continue to track the story for you. South Africa and its journey insofar as not only the US is concerned, but this narrative that's been perpetuated by certain groups. In fact, in the 1 o'clock hour, we've got the CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, Janet Jobson, has written about Donald Trump's theories and she's written about white supremacy.